Will you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, may we in this time together be good stewards of the call that you have set before us. May we plant seeds where they need to grow. May the words of my mouth and meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So you all have perhaps noticed that this stewardship month, this is the last Sunday of it, it has not included any sort of request for a pledge. Now, cards on the table, from a practical standpoint, I believe that asking your congregation to make a pledge is a good and faithful thing to do. That said, it is something that I acknowledge and respect you all have chosen not to do recently, and so it didn't feel right to try to scramble and put one together on such short notice. So we've done something that I think is also just as faithful. We've engaged with sacred stories and wondered about how those stories might help us make meaning of stewardship. In addition to those stories, each week a member of our congregation has reflected upon a pillar of stewardship: time, talent, community impact, and today, finally, treasure. Now, if you were around here at Christmas Eve, then you've heard my reflection on why financial giving, even if it feels awkward to talk about, is a good thing to do. I will save you the spiel today, but know that you will hear it again on Easter, and I'll let you all imagine why we've chosen Christmas Eve and Easter to trot that message out. But for today, we are sitting with the parable of the sower, a story about growth, particularly growth in faith. And you may recall that a few sermons ago, I think this past summer after the Barbie movie came out, I joked about ministers being storytellers, or in my case, an associate storyteller. So this morning, I want you to get comfortable as I put on my storytelling hat. The year is 1873, and as U.S. churches work to figure out what they should do in the midst of a reuniting republic, and what to do with millions of formerly enslaved persons who are now citizens, a curious thing takes place: church planting.
Microphone.
Now, this happens all across the South. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, they all engage in the work of planting new churches. I would note that Congregationalists don't really do that in the South, and that's because of an agreement from the 1830s where they split the country in half with Presbyterians. And so if you drive a lot, you might note that as you drive up the eastern seaboard, Presbyterians disappear and Congregationalists appear. And if you drive south, the reverse happens. I will note, however, that Congregationalists were deeply involved in forming colleges and universities for formerly enslaved persons. In fact, today, the majority of historically black colleges in this country, in the South, were founded by the UCC. Back to our story. A woman by the name of Nancy Ann Feasel, this is still in 1873, she transfers a plot of land to the Methodist Episcopal Church, a predecessor of today's United Methodists. She does this for the purpose of building a church. And the land that she offers is up on a hill. It's a bit rocky, and there's a really random, steep, sudden drop-off. But for $5, the church says, that'll do. Now, there aren't a ton of records as to what happens the next few decades on this particular plot of land, but one way that you can kind of track if a church is sticking around is whether or not a cemetery appears. And for about 40 years, there are no marked graves, so we can assume that despite the best intention, despite planting the seeds, no church took root. And I think that that connects to stewardship right now in this story, because there was certainly a goal in mind when Nancy Feasel made her gift, but the supporting pieces, they weren't quite there. So the seeds quite literally landed upon rocky ground. The roots weren't going to be deep enough. Move through the next 40 or 50 years, and there's some change in land ownership. And around 1910, a deed appears that says for the sum of $1, a group of men acting on behalf of a Methodist church will take possession of the land, and that possession will extend 4 generations until there is no longer an active ministry there. Now, the difference between this deed and the deed from 1873 is that the first time the seeds were cast in the hopes that something might grow. This time, they know there's already good soil here, and they're casting seeds again. This time they already have a church. It's got a name, it's got people behind it, they've got a responsibility for the present and a commitment to the future. A few good seeds on good soil. Now, it's here that I'll tell you in the story that I have a particular interest in this community of faith because 2 of the 4 men who signed that deed in 1910 were members of my family, a great uncle and a 3rd great grandfather. Over the next few years, indeed, that church, then Pruitt Hill Methodist Episcopal Church, was built. And so it was a cemetery. So we know it stuck. And as was common at the time in rural Tennessee, where there were black churches, there tended to be a school for black children. This same schoolhouse is the one that my grandfather and his siblings would attend K through 8. This church is the one that my grandfather taught Sunday school at for decades. So my mother and her siblings learned hymns and spirituals that they randomly recall today. It's in this church where I first experienced the kind of community that I think and know that church can help support. You note I said help, it doesn't do it alone, it can help. Because a few rows back from where my family sat, on the right side is where my old babysitter, Miss Francine, would sit. And stage right at the pulpit is where one of my favorite great aunts would sing in the choir, very often off tune, but she would sing nonetheless. It's also in that church where my siblings and I were first introduced to the idea of participating in an offering. Every Sunday my parents would pass my siblings and I each a single dollar, and we would huff and puff as we were told to put the dollar in the plate instead of our pocket. But the lesson stuck. Give as you are able, and you will receive so much more than you have put in. And I think, personally, there's something poetic in the reality that our family helped secure that very land for $1, and that every Sunday, my siblings and I put a same dollar into the ministry of that church. I think there's something to be said in the reality that now, more than a century later, that church, way out in the country, again, rural Tennessee, still accessible only by an unpaved gravel road up this steep hill, attended by folks who tend to fall on the lower side of the socioeconomic order, that church still stands upon a hill. We know from our story today that Eric read, the seeds sown in the good soil are people who hear the message, accept it, and bear 30, 60, or 100 times more than what was planted. I don't say this out of hubris, but I think that initial $5 from Nancy Fiesel and the $1 from the 4 men has easily borne 100 times more than what was planted. And if you listen closely to the dedication that I offer when the offering is brought forward, you might note that I almost always say something along the lines of, we offer these gifts to you with the hope and faith that we will be good stewards of your call for us in the world. And that brings us back to 1873. Part of the handwritten deed that Nancy Fiesel signed in that initial transfer of land to the Methodist Church read as follows: for the sum of $5, for the love of learning and love of the gospel, I have granted, bargained, sold, and hereby convey all my title claims to this land, casting seeds, hoping they will grow. Isn't it a wonderful thing what a gift like that, just $5 and then a few decades more, $1 more, so $6 big dollars, what they can do for the work of Christ's church and the world. Now, because this isn't my usual form of preaching, I'm going to take a few more minutes and tell you one more story, just to address the title of this sermon, and it will connect, I promise. So the title, Half Acre, Full Acre, comes from a quote from my grandfather from an interview he gave in the newspaper a few decades ago. For context, for much of his life, he has been a part-time farmer. He was actually one of the first commercial tomato growers in Greene County, Tennessee. And in his first year of growing, he planted a full acre of Manipal tomatoes. It's a variety of heirloom, and if you were eating tomatoes in the 1960s and you lived on the East Coast, you probably ate this variety of tomato. It is a fantastic fruit. It's incredibly resistant to disease, it doesn't wilt, and it produces an incredible yield, sometimes too much to bear. In that first year, with that first full acre, some of the plants my grandfather planted did not grow, or they died on the vine. He had cast all these seeds, but the ground just wasn't ready and good enough. He wasn't prepared enough to steward those seeds and what they might become, and he just couldn't do it. After that, he would only plant half an acre going forward. And wouldn't you know it, that the half acre produced more. He said that by working steadily, the profit from the half acre was greater than the full acre from the first year. A farmer went out to plant seeds and saw how the seeds grew, and he adapted to what he had learned. I think there's a lesson there too for the church. We are called to be planters, and at times too to adapt to how we plant. Seeds require good soil and care to grow. It takes time, it takes effort, but if we do it right, I think the yield will be so very worth it. So my prayer for us this day is that we might invest in sowing seeds, because we might have some amount of faith that there is fertile ground out there from which new ministries might spring forth, and that we might accept the reality that those new ministries may come in forms that we have yet to even imagine, that what happens here might be passed down through generations, each one making this faith their own, all in service of Christ's church. I will tell you that every month I participate in our church offering by sending a check, or my bank does, because I don't own a checkbook. But on this day, I'm going to put $5 and $1 more into the plate, so a grand total of $6. Because I have seen the great and good work that just $6 can do for Christ's call for all of us in the world. And my prayer is that you might see that too. You might join me in adding just $6 to the plate. Amen.
The volume was turned down. I remember we had to turn the volume way up before. No wonder. That jump.